I'm Doug Fern, and this is my take on music recording. Before I start this episode on plugins versus hardware, I'd like to take a minute to cover a couple of odds and ends. First, this topic was suggested by a listener. I have a list of about a dozen questions and topics from listeners, and I would like to include all of them in future episodes. However, some are fairly simple and can be answered in a couple of minutes. I plan to do a Q&A episode soon covering multiple questions. If you have questions you think I could answer or topics you would like to hear my take on, please send them to me. Email dwfern@dwfern.com and I will add yours to the list. I probably won't include some that are too specific, such as information on a single piece of gear, but otherwise anything goes. Second, as you probably know, this podcast is carried by almost all podcast providers, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you already subscribe through one of those providers, thanks. But if not, it helps build my audience if you subscribe. Making this podcast is a lot of work, and I want to maximize the number of people who might benefit. So please subscribe. That way, each episode can automatically download to your listening device if you want, or you can get notifications and download the ones you want to listen to. From the beginning, I have had a relatively small email list that I send notifications to of each episode at the time it is posted. I only send one email for each episode. If you would like to receive that, send me an email saying so, and I will add you to the list. I always enjoy hearing from my listeners and try to respond to every email I get. Okay, today I want to talk about plugins and the hardware they emulate. I should tell you that I personally do not use many plugins myself, mainly because I have lots of hardware equalizers and compressors that my company makes, plus a couple of hardware digital reverbs, so I'm definitely not a plug-in power user. But I do use some. I use a Flux Elixir limiter plugin on the mix bus after my usual VT7 compressor and VT5 EQ. It doesn't do much in my mixes since I don't like the sound of highly compressed, very loud mixes. But the Elixir does provide protection against a few peaks that would otherwise reduce the overall level of the mix. A software limiter has some advantages over hardware, mainly because it can look ahead at the audio coming and capture those peaks in a transparent and music-friendly way. I use Melodyne very selectively to correct off-pitch vocals and instruments, but only if I feel the note or notes detract from the overall impact of the song. And even then, I usually only correct the note to the point where it no longer bothers me. Other than those two applications, I don't feel the need for any additional plugins. I do not use EQ or compression on individual tracks very much. I try to get the tracks I record to be as close to the final sound I want during the recording. That always seems a better way to do it, at least for me. I should also say that there's a plug-in version of the DW Fern VT5 equalizer, which was created by Acoustica Audio. And Acoustica is working on a plug-in for my VT7 compressor. More on those in a minute. I know that my workflow is a bit different from what most people do these days, so you can take my comments with a grain of salt. But what I do works well for me, but it might not be best for you. The basic question I get asked a lot is whether I think a plugin can accurately represent the sound of a hardware device. I think that at our current state-of-the-art, plugins sound remarkably good. Do they sound exactly like the hardware? I don't think so, but they are close and getting better all the time. After designing the VT5 equalizer over a period of a couple of years, listening to it on a wide range of sounds, and tweaking it so it became as good as I could make it, I have a very good idea of what it sounds like. After all, it's the only EQ I use. So when plugin designers started talking to me about the possibility of a VT5 plugin, I knew it was going to be challenged to get it perfect. Acoustica came about as close as possible, at least without having a dedicated computer just to run the emulation. That is always a trade-off for plugin designers. How much CPU power can you devote to making the plugin more accurate? It is a compromise. The VT5 plugin uses a lot of processing power to get as close as possible to the sound of the hardware, and that can become a problem for some people who might use several iterations of it in a mix, especially if they have an older, slower computer. After a couple years of refining the VT5 plugin, I was finally satisfied that it captured most of the essence of the hardware. Is it exactly the same? Not quite in certain subtle details, but it is remarkably close. We went through many versions to get it to that point, and I am happy with the result. Equalizers are one of the easiest things to emulate, at least in their EQ curves and phase shifts. For the Acoustica VT5 plugin, called Ruby, the equalization matches the hardware in every way. Where there is a slight difference is in duplicating the sound of the vacuum tube electronics. The differences become one of feel rather than measurement. Despite our ability to analyze and measure how a device performs, I believe there are still things we cannot measure, at least not today. I don't even know how to describe those things, but when I listen, I can detect a difference in how the sound makes me feel. Not very scientific, I know, but music is an emotional experience, so we have to let ourselves be open to how the music makes us feel, and the same applies to the process of recording that music. The VT7 compressor emulation, on the other hand, is much more challenging. There is so much going on in a compression circuit that it takes a lot of computer horsepower to begin to duplicate it to any degree of accuracy. Will Acoustica get there? I have confidence that they will, but it won't be made available until I am totally happy with it. And the talented people at Acoustica are doing their best to make that happen. The people involved can really hear. They are all great musicians as well as talented software engineers, and I know they can do it. So those are some of my personal experiences with plugins versus hardware from a different perspective than the typical user might have. But what about other plugins that attempt to duplicate real hardware devices? I have tried many from a variety of plugin manufacturers, and most are pretty good. I also encounter a lot of plugins that just sound bad to my ear. Do they duplicate the hardware? Probably not, especially the ones that sound bad to me. The sound of most vintage gear has degraded over the years, even if they have been rebuilt. Modern electronic parts can sound different from those used 60 years ago. On top of that, those old products tend to all sound slightly different when you compare several different units, so the plug-in sound may not sound like another piece of the same hardware. Does that make them unwise to use? For most people, no. If you are getting the sound you hear in your head out of the plugins you use, that is an indication that it is doing the job. I urge you to evaluate a plugin not only by how it accomplishes what you want, but also by how it feels to you. I'm sure every hit record you hear these days used a bunch of plugins. That did not stop the records from being very successful, so that also might be a criterion to consider. Could the recording have been better using the hardware? Probably, but in the world of popular music, sometimes okay is good enough. I am cursed with the need for perfection, and although I have never achieved that, I keep trying. What would really help a lot of recordings is a simplification of the recording process. The less you torture the audio, the better it sounds. If you get the instruments and vocals to sound the way you want during the tracking process, a chain of plugins on every channel may not be necessary. Microphone choice, pattern choice, mic placement, the place in the room, the bleed from other instruments, etc., all shape the sound. You can get a lot of control over the sounds that way. I have covered this in the past, so I won't add anything more about it today. Classic hardware can be very expensive, perhaps 250 times more than a plug-in version. That is the deciding factor for many recordists. They cannot usually justify the tens of thousands of dollars for a classic hardware device, so the plug-in is the logical alternative. And there is not much to go wrong with a plug-in, unlike the constant need for maintenance to keep old hardware running. And that's true for hardware, too. I know the DW Fern products are very expensive. I wish that wasn't the case, but to build no-compromise hardware with a 50-plus years life expectancy costs a lot. Especially when starting out, many recordists have to use plugins to achieve the sound they want. Maybe someday they will be able to afford the real hardware, but in the meantime, plugins are a good solution. I can't argue with that. Plugins can be a cost-effective way to evaluate the sound of hardware you might buy later. I know our VT5 hardware sales increased when the Ruby plugin version became available. Additionally, you can use multiple versions of a plugin as needed and not be stuck with just one piece of hardware. Although you can use the same hardware on multiple tracks, if you want to spend the time to create a new version of it on another track, the convenience of a plugin cannot be denied. If you have both hardware and software versions, you can use the better sounding hardware on most of the critical tracks and the plug-in version on the others. So far, I've only talked about typical outboard gear emulations, things like compressors and equalizers. Plugins can emulate other outboard gear like reverbs, delays, pitch changers, and other things, some of which are impossible to do in hardware. Those types of devices, in my experience, are marginally good at their job, whether based on hardware or not. I have heard some plug-in reverbs, for example, that sound remarkably good at first listen, but ultimately they do not hold up when mixing. I prefer the old-fashioned approach of using individual sends from the tracks that need reverb, all sent to one hardware reverb device, with the return coming up on a separate fader. There is a cohesiveness of sound obtained that way that I find preferable to a bunch of different reverb sounds. Your experience may be different. In my studio, I use two hardware digital reverbs, a Quantec and a Bricasti M7. In a sense, they are both essentially the same as a plug-in because they emulate the sound of real rooms or classic reverb devices like plates or an acoustic echo chamber. The advantage to me is the versatility the hardware provides. However, most people use plug-in reverbs exclusively. I am sure your DAW has a way to route your echo sends and returns to achieve the same overall reverb sound as I use. You might be surprised at the difference. I am doing an episode on reverb next, so I will leave that topic for then. Another interesting use of a software emulation of real hardware is when a hardware designer develops an interesting circuit as a one-off, and then it is analyzed and made into a plugin. I have had several hardware product ideas that I think would be interesting to try, but some electronic components required are so rare that manufacturing is out of the question. There are many old vacuum tube types from the 1930s and 40s that have very interesting properties, but they are rare. Classic audio transformers are another example of a way to create unique-sounding hardware devices. At some point, I want to build a device using parts that are not readily available, and if it works well enough that I would use it on my own sessions, I would see if it could be made into a plugin. Only one hardware version would be necessary, or perhaps even possible. Another plugin design approach is to create a device emulation from scratch without any hardware antecedent. This is becoming more prevalent as designers' imaginations allow them to create totally new virtual devices, perhaps with unique properties. That could be pretty exciting to try, and maybe I will work on that at some point. I don't have the coding skills to do it myself, but I certainly know people who could. The challenge is translating the sound in my head into a description that a software expert could interpret. So, those are my thoughts on the current state of plugins. They are an incredible tool in many cases. Their ability to emulate actual hardware devices is very good, but not perfect. There is a big opportunity to create software that could do things that no hardware ever could. My only caution is to always use the minimal amount of sound manipulation as necessary to achieve your goal. A chain of plugins sometimes makes the sound worse, not better. Capture it expertly at the tracking stage, and the need for further manipulation can be minimized. This is my take on music recording. I'm Doug Fern. See you next time.